Imagine it's 1st December 2001. You are a 42-year-old hardware store owner living in Buenos Aires, Argentina. You rent a small apartment above your shop in Caballito with a narrow balcony that catches the afternoon sun and the noise of buses. Your wife keeps the family accounts in a notebook by the fridge, and the numbers still make sense. You have $18,000 in the bank from 10 years of work, enough for your daughter's university fees and a used delivery van. Every morning, you lift the metal shutter, count the pesos in the till, and trust that 1 peso still means $1 because the government has promised it for years. On Sundays, you eat with your parents, talk about football, and tell yourself that whatever politicians do in Congress, your savings are finally safe. If you have ever wondered why Argentina can seem stable one moment and shattered the next, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before, it has happened again, and each time it leaves the same fingerprints on ordinary lives. If you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Then the radio changes tone. Economy Minister Domingo Cavallo announces emergency limits on bank withdrawals. The number sounds small enough to calm you and large enough to insult you at the same time, 250 pesos a week. You walk to your branch and find a line already curling around the block. People are not shouting yet. That comes later. First comes the look. The look people get when they realize the promise they built their life on was made of paper. In the weeks that follow, the peg breaks, the banks freeze, the president flees by helicopter, and Argentina burns through 5 presidents in 2 weeks. By the time the dust settles, the economy has shrunk by about a fifth, poverty has exploded, and more than $100 billion of debt has gone into default. But this story is not really about one bad month in Buenos Aires. It is about a cycle. Argentina does not simply suffer random crises. History shows a repeated chain of cause and effect, almost like a machine that keeps resetting itself. A government spends more than it can honestly raise. To avoid the pain of cutting back, it prints money or borrows dollars. To hide the damage, it props up the currency or controls prices. For a while, daily life looks normal. Then trust breaks. People run to dollars. The peso drops. Banks crack. Politics turns frantic. And the people who believe the last promise pay the bill. That is what this video is about. Not why Argentina is cursed, not why Argentines are careless, but why the same economic trap keeps reappearing in different disguises, and why almost every decade the country seems to step on the same loose floorboard again. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Argentina's collapses do not begin on the day the headlines arrive. They begin years earlier, when the state starts spending like a family using 3 credit cards to pay for groceries, while pretending next month's bonus will fix everything. Sometimes the gap is filled by printing pesos. Sometimes it is filled by borrowing in dollars. Sometimes it is both. The method changes. The logic does not. The country wants a rich country lifestyle with a tax base and an export base that often cannot support it for long. When commodity prices are high or global investors are in a generous mood, the system can keep smiling. But beneath that smile is a balance of payments problem, which means the country needs hard currency from exports or loans to pay for imports, debt, and trust. When those dollars slow down, the whole structure starts to wobble. Think of Argentina's economy like a beautiful theater set held up by ropes behind the curtain. From the audience, the palace looks solid. Behind it, stagehands are sweating. One rope is the budget deficit. Another is the central bank printing money. Another is foreign debt. Another is the public's habit of saving in dollars because it no longer believes in the local currency. If one rope snaps, the others take the strain. If 2 snap at once, the painted palace folds in on itself. This is why the crisis always seems sudden to outsiders and strangely familiar to Argentines. They are not watching a lightning strike. They are listening for the old beams to creak again. The names change, the slogans change, the parties change. But, as a 2019 study of Argentina's monetary and fiscal history put it, the country's repeated crises were symptoms of one recurrent problem: the failure to tame the fiscal deficit. Between 1969 and 1991, Argentina removed 13 zeros from its currency. 13. That is not just inflation. That is a country editing its own arithmetic because the old numbers became embarrassing. Once you understand that, the rest of the story starts to line up. This brings us directly to the first part of the cycle. The collapse usually begins with a lie that feels compassionate. The lie says the state can spend far more than it collects, protect everyone from the pain, and somehow keep money honest anyway. In Argentina, this lie did not begin in 1989, but 1989 is when it became impossible to miss. Raúl Alfonsín had returned the country to democracy in 1983 after military rule. That mattered. People wanted normal politics again. They wanted wages that meant something again. They wanted a future that did not smell like fear. But the books did not balance. Public payrolls swelled, revenues lagged, tax collection was weak. Reuters later noted that in 1989, only about 30,000 out of 30 million Argentines paid income tax. The state kept making promises with one hand and reaching for the printing press with the other. Inflation had already been a long disease in Argentina, but in 1989 it turned into a fever dream. That year, annual inflation reached roughly 5,000%. Let that sink in. Prices were not rising every year. They were rising so fast that the year stopped being a useful unit of time. Reuters reported that some supermarkets read prices over the intercom instead of updating price tags. Imagine standing in the aisle with a bag of flour in your hand while a voice from the ceiling tells you the price has changed again. Money was becoming a melting ice cube. Hold it too long and it vanished in your hand. This did not just ruin budgets, it destroyed behavior. Workers rushed to spend wages the moment they were paid. Shop owners restocked as if running from a fire. Families turned salaries into canned food, dollars, or anything that might still have value by next week. Looting broke out in some places because hunger had a faster timetable than reform. Strikes spread. Alfonsín handed power to Carlos Menem 5 months early. That is what inflation at that scale does. It does not simply make life expensive, it bends political time. It makes governments age in dog years. Now here is where it gets interesting. Argentina's 1989 hyperinflation was not just about greedy shopkeepers or nervous consumers. It was the end stage of a state that had lost the right to ask people to trust its money. When a government cannot convincingly fund itself through taxes or stable borrowing, it starts taxing people through inflation instead. Inflation is a hidden tax. No one mails you the bill. Your wallet just gets lighter while it sits in your pocket. And the poorest people pay it fastest because they hold the most cash and the fewest protected assets. In Argentina, the middle class learned an old lesson again. Do not fall in love with the peso. The people hurt first were salaried workers, pensioners, and anyone whose income arrived slower than prices moved. The people with some protection were those who could shift into dollars, goods, or assets tied to export earnings. Not because they were smarter in some abstract way, because in a country where money is being watered down, the winners are often the ones standing closest to something real. A warehouse of grain, a piece of land, cash in a hard currency, a business that can reset prices quickly. That is why collapse in Argentina feels less like a storm that hits everyone equally and more like acid rain. The same sky covers everyone, but some materials dissolve faster than others. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. Hyperinflation did not scare Argentina straight forever. It scared Argentina into the next workaround. In 1991, Economy Minister Domingo Cavallo introduced the convertibility law, fixing 1 peso to $1. After years of chaos, this felt like oxygen. Inflation fell sharply. People could plan again. Shops could tag products without apology. The country seemed to have found a steel spine at last, but part of that spine was borrowed. A currency peg can stop inflation, but it can also trap a country if it becomes too rigid. If the peso is locked to the dollar while the economy loses competitiveness, the currency starts to function like a suit tailored for someone else's body. It may look elegant. It may even feel powerful at first, but eventually it cuts off your circulation. Here's something I want you to think about before we go further. If a promise finally gives people stability after years of chaos, how long would you keep believing it even after the numbers underneath start to rot? Drop your answer in the comments, seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. And it changes everything. The 1990s in Argentina are often remembered as a story of reform, privatization, and a return to seriousness. And for a while, many of those descriptions felt true. Inflation fell to single digits. Imported goods flooded shop windows. Buenos Aires looked less like a city escaping a crisis, and more like one rejoining the developed world. Families took mortgages. Businesses borrowed. Foreign money came in. The peso was trusted because it was chained to the dollar. But that chain had a cost. Argentina could not easily devalue to absorb shocks. It could not print freely without breaking the very promise that made the system believable. When trouble hit abroad, Argentina had to absorb the shock without the usual escape hatch. A strong currency that once felt like armor started to act more like a cast on a broken leg, rigid and painful. Contagion from the Asian financial crisis in 1997 and Russia's default in 1998 helped pull capital out of emerging markets. Brazil, Argentina's giant neighbor, devalued in 1999. That made Argentine goods even less competitive. At the same time, the government, unable to print money under the peg, borrowed instead. The problem did not disappear. It changed costume. Instead of inflating away the deficit, the state stacked up debt in a currency it did not control. Economists call this a currency mismatch. In plain English, it means earning in pesos while owing in dollars. It is like getting paid in buckets of water while promising to return bricks. The numbers may match on paper for a while. In a panic, they no longer weigh the same. By 2001, the set was wobbling again. Unemployment climbed above 20%. Hunger and malnutrition were being reported in a country famous for food exports. Families who had believed the peg meant adulthood and safety discovered that the system needed their confidence more than it deserved it. As deposits fled the banks, the government imposed the corralito in December 2001, limiting withdrawals to 250 pesos a week. Think about what that means in ordinary life. Rent still existed. Suppliers still wanted payment. A sick parent still needed medicine. School bills did not freeze because your account did. The state had built a fence around people's own money and then asked them to remain calm. The social effect was volcanic. Protesters banged pots in the streets. Banks became symbols of betrayal. President Fernando de la Rua resigned and left the presidential palace by helicopter. Reuters described a country that went through 5 presidents in just 2 weeks. Before the crisis ended, Argentina's economy had shrunk by about a fifth. The World Bank reported that poverty rose from 37% in 2001 to 58% by the end of 2002. Extreme poverty jumped from 6% to 28%. Unemployment peaked at 22% in May 2002. Families cut food, delayed medical checkups, lost utility connections, and leaned on barter clubs and neighborhood credit just to keep going. The middle class did not disappear, but a large part of it was shoved downward hard enough to leave a permanent bruise. Look at what happened next. The peg broke. The peso devalued. Dollar deposits were converted. Lawsuits multiplied. Trust died faster than prices could be relabeled. And yet, after the wreckage, some parts of the economy recovered with shocking speed. Why? Because once the peso was no longer grotesquely overvalued, exporters became competitive again. Soy, agriculture, and other tradable sectors suddenly had oxygen. That is one of Argentina's cruelest patterns. The system is often kept artificially strong until it snaps. Then, after enormous pain, the devaluation that was politically impossible becomes economically useful. It is like refusing to reset a badly dislocated shoulder because the procedure would hurt, then waiting until the whole arm goes numb. This leads to the second part of the story. After a collapse, Argentina often gets a fresh window. The bad debts are restructured, the exchange rate is reset, commodity prices help, people swear never again. Then, slowly, the old temptations return. Spending creeps, controls multiply, confidence is treated as something that can be ordered rather than earned. By the time Mauricio Macri took office in late 2015, he was trying to normalize an economy already distorted by years of subsidies, capital controls, inflation, and statistical mistrust. Investors were hopeful. In 2017, many thought Argentina had turned another corner. Then 2018 arrived, and the floor gave way again. The 2018 crisis did not look like 1989. Supermarkets were not using intercoms to update flour prices every hour. It did not look exactly like 2001 either. There was no one-to-one peg about to explode, but the same anatomy was there underneath. Argentina still had weak public finances. It still depended heavily on foreign financing. It still had high inflation, limited policy credibility, a narrow export base, and a society that reflexively ran to the dollar when fear entered the room. When global conditions tightened and investors became less forgiving, the peso plunged. Reuters reported that the central bank hiked interest rates to 45% and sold billions of dollars in reserves trying to defend the currency. The effort looked dramatic. It was also revealing. A central bank burning reserves to defend a distrusted currency is like a homeowner using bottled water to hold back a flood. It shows determination. It also shows how late the problem has become. Argentina turned to the International Monetary Fund for a loan. First $50 billion, then $57 billion, the largest IMF program in the fund's history at the time. To some observers, this looked like salvation. To others, it looked like another version of the same national habit, borrowing time instead of rebuilding trust. The IMF's own later evaluation said the program was too fragile for Argentina's structural problems. Reuters summarized those problems as weak public finances, rigid budgets, high dollarization, a small domestic financial sector, and a narrow export base. That sentence is almost a perfect X-ray of the cycle. The country had not solved the old puzzle. It had refinanced it. The numbers turned ugly fast. The peso lost more than half its value in 2018. Inflation surged above 50% by 2019. The economy fell into a deep recession that, as Reuters noted in late 2021, had only then begun to lift. Public debt climbed from around half of GDP in 2017 to close to 90% by the end of 2019. Poverty rose above 35%. Once again, the cost did not land evenly. People with fixed local incomes watched their purchasing power break apart. Businesses that depended on imported inputs were squeezed. Families who measured life in bus fares, meat prices, and school supplies felt the crisis long before they could explain it in policy language. And yet the script was familiar enough that Argentines already had cultural muscle memory for it. They bought dollars when they could. They distrusted banks. They talked about the blue dollar, the unofficial exchange rate, as casually as weather. By 2021, Reuters noted a near 100% gap between the official exchange rate and a parallel market rate. That gap is more than a market oddity. It is a public opinion poll with numbers attached. It says what people believe money is worth when the state stops telling the truth convincingly. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you're still here, you're not most people. Hit subscribe, because the next section is the part this channel was made for. The part they never put in textbooks. Now, look at all three together. 1989, 2001, 2018. Different governments, different slogans, different international contexts, same mechanism. First, the state promises more than the economy can fund through durable taxes and durable export earnings. Second, it bridges the gap with money creation, foreign borrowing, or both. Third, it tries to suppress the warning signs, either with a currency anchor, capital controls, subsidies, accounting tricks, or official optimism. Fourth, people begin to doubt. And once doubt enters an economy like Argentina's, it runs straight to the dollar. Deposits leave, reserves fall, the peso weakens, prices jump, politics panics. Then the reset comes, always wrapped in language about emergency, sacrifice, and national rebirth. The same mechanism, different decades, same result. That is why Argentina can look so contradictory from the outside. On paper, it has vast farmland, energy resources, an educated population, and one of the strongest cultural memories of financial trauma on Earth. In practice, it keeps circling the same drain because each phase of the cycle creates the conditions for the next. Inflation makes people hate the peso. That pushes savings into dollars. Dollar dependence makes devaluation more dangerous. Fear of devaluation encourages governments to defend the currency too long. Defending the currency drains reserves or forces more borrowing. More borrowing creates future panic. It is a hall of mirrors where every attempted escape becomes another trap. And Argentina is not alone. Greece in 2015 imposed capital controls and ATM limits during its debt crisis. Lebanon, after 2019, trapped depositors behind informal banking restrictions. As the currency collapsed and poverty surged, the faces change, the flags change. But when a state promises more than its production, tax base, and credibility can sustain, the ending becomes grimly familiar. Banks stop feeling like vaults and start feeling like waiting rooms. Money stops feeling like stored effort and starts feeling like a rumor. Argentina's special tragedy is not that it invented this pattern. It is that it has rehearsed it so many times that the cues are almost cultural memory. And this is where history gets most uncomfortable of all. Repeated collapse does not just damage balance sheets, it reshapes character. It teaches children to watch exchange boards. It teaches grandparents to hide dollars in kitchens, walls, and safety boxes. It teaches workers to spend faster than they save. It teaches business owners to treat every calm period as temporary. A nation can survive that, but it cannot become fully stable while that survival logic keeps winning over public trust. Who pays for this most directly? Not the politician who gave the speech, not the consultant who caught the next flight, not the large exporter with dollar income. The people history keeps placing under the falling ceiling are much more ordinary. They are pensioners living on fixed payments in pesos. They are school teachers whose salary negotiations move slower than inflation. They are shop owners with shelves full of imported stock bought at one exchange rate and customers paid at another. They are parents who do not need an economics lecture to understand that meat, bus fares, and electricity are moving faster than their wages. The World Bank's reporting on Argentina after the 2001 collapse is brutally specific. Nearly 3/4 of households cut food consumption. More than 9 in 10 switched to cheaper foods. Many reduced school spending. Around a fifth to a quarter of the poorest households were disconnected from electricity or phone service for non-payment. More than a third of families with young children reduced medical checkups. That is what a macroeconomic crisis means when it enters a kitchen. It means thinner soup, dimmer rooms, untreated illnesses, and children learning the mood of adults by the way they whisper over bills. The middle class often suffers a different kind of wound. It is not just hunger. It is humiliation. In Argentina's 2001-2002 crash, people who thought of themselves as stable suddenly found themselves trading goods in barter clubs, pleading with banks, or selling cars and jewelry to stay upright. The World Bank noted the rise of the so-called new poor, households that had not grown up in chronic poverty but were pushed into it by the collapse. There is a special bitterness in falling. When you have always been poor, survival is already part of the routine. When you are newly poor, you lose not just money but identity. Collapse strips social class like paint from a wall. Now observe who often walks away in better shape. People with assets linked to hard currency, owners of farmland or export businesses after devaluation, families with foreign income, people who owe little and can wait. In the early 2000s, agricultural exporters benefited once the peso weakened, and Argentina's tradable sectors regained competitiveness. Later, As soy exports boomed, the country grew strongly for a period. This does not mean crises are secretly good. They are not. It means the damage is uneven, and the rebound often begins in sectors connected to dollars, while peso earners are still counting losses. Collapse behaves like a staircase tilted against the middle. Some slide down faster because they stand on cash, wages, and trust. Others find handholds because they stand on land, export revenue, or external savings. And this is why repeated crises corrode society beyond the economic charts. They teach a moral lesson that may be rational but is poisonous. Trust less, hide more, think shorter. If your grandfather lost savings in one bank freeze and your parents lost purchasing power in an inflation spiral, then stuffing dollars under a mattress does not sound backward. It sounds responsible. Reuters reported that Argentines today hold enormous amounts of dollar savings outside the formal system. That is not just tax avoidance or habit. It is the memory of betrayal made physical. A country cannot build deep domestic finance if its citizens believe the local system is a trap with polished marble floors. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing. And it might change everything. So what did the survivors of Argentina's many collapses seem to share? Not one ideology, not one party, not one magic asset. The historical record shows that those who came through these periods largely shared three characteristics. First, they distrusted official calm when the underlying numbers no longer matched the story. They understood that confidence is not the same as solvency. A smiling minister does not refill reserves. A patriotic speech does not lower a deficit. Survivors tended to notice the beams, not the wallpaper. Second, they valued flexibility more than perfection. Families that endured repeated crises, often kept expenses adaptable, avoided building their whole lives around one fixed promise, and maintained some access to things outside the peso system, whether that meant foreign currency, export income, family abroad, or simply a business that could reprice quickly. Again, this is not a recommendation. It is a pattern in the record. In unstable systems, rigid people break first. Flexible people bend, sometimes painfully, but they stay standing. A tree in a flood does not survive by arguing with the current. It survives by moving with it without uprooting completely. Third, survivors tended to rely on networks as much as on balance sheets. During Argentina's worst periods, families leaned on relatives, neighborhood stores, informal credit, community kitchens, barter clubs, and shared housing. That may sound small beside central bank policy, but history is lived at human scale. When formal systems freeze, informal systems become the emergency bloodstream. The families who endured were often the ones with relationships they could draw on before desperation arrived. There's also a darker lesson. Some of the people who did best were not morally superior or especially farsighted. They were simply closer to power, closer to dollars, or quicker to move money when ordinary people still believed the official story. That is uncomfortable, but it matters. Crises do not only reward prudence, they also reward proximity. The people nearest the exit leave the burning theater first. Argentina's repeated collapses have taught generations that information moves unevenly and protection is not distributed fairly. Which brings us to the present rhyme. Argentina ended 2023 with annual inflation of 201.4%, the highest in more than 3 decades. In the first half of 2024, the official poverty rate rose to 52.9%, up from 40.1% a year earlier. Those are not predictions. Those are facts from the current chapter. And they rhyme painfully with older ones. The names have changed. The proposed cures have changed. But the social reality still looks familiar. Prices outrunning wages, trust lagging behind policy, and ordinary people being asked to endure one more painful adjustment in exchange for the promise that this time the reset will hold. Return now to the hardware store owner in Buenos Aires on 1st December 2001. He does not care about elegant theories. He cares about whether the money for his daughter's tuition is still there on Monday. He cares about whether his supplier will take a check. He cares about whether his wife should buy canned food today instead of next week. When the bank doors narrow and the peso promise breaks, he learns what millions of Argentines have learned in different decades and under different presidents. A collapse is never only about debt or exchange rates. It is about time stolen from ordinary lives. Years of work, years of planning, years of trust. Some Argentines recovered. Many rebuilt. Some even prospered in the years after devaluation, especially in export sectors, or with access to hard currency. But the scar remained. That scar is one reason Argentina's economy is so hard to stabilize. People remember. They remember the intercom prices of 1989. They remember the bank lines of 2001. They remember the runaway peso of 2018. They remember that between 1969 and 1991, the country had to remove 13 zeros from its currency. They remember that sovereign default has happened again and again. History in Argentina is not a textbook on a shelf. It is a second accounting system running quietly beside the official one. And that is the cycle nobody breaks easily. Not because Argentines do not understand it. Many understand it better than outsiders ever will. The cycle survives because each crisis creates habits of fear, dollarization, short-term politics, and institutional weakness that make the next crisis easier to trigger. It is a wheel that grinds its own track deeper every time it turns. The hope, if there is one, lies not in pretending the pattern is mysterious, but in naming it clearly. States cannot spend without limit. Currencies cannot command trust by decree. Stability bought with borrowed dollars is still borrowed stability. Sooner or later, the bill arrives. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.